1, 2, 3, 4.
Hello and welcome into the Cubs on Deck podcast. I am your host today. My name is Greg Huss. And like I said, today is just solo. It's just a solo episode with me because we are wrapping up the season previews of the Cubs minor league affiliates. I'm recording this today on Thursday, April 3rd. That is in preparation for opening day for the Knoxville Smokies, the South Bend Cubs, and the Myrtle Beach Pelicans season. We've gotten just shy of a week of action from the Iowa Cubs. We've gotten to watch them play. We've enjoyed that. We've enjoyed the last few episodes that have been Iowa Cubs geared, between having Alex Cohen on the show, Jason Kempf on the show, and Tommy Birch from the Des Moines Register on the show. That's been a blast. But today we do want to talk about the Knoxville Smokies. We want to give them some flowers as we head into this season. This is going to be, like I said, just me. It'll be a quicker show. We won't go over 45 minutes for sure. We'll see how long this actually ends up going. I always say some of the shows are shorter, and even with me talking, just me, they tend to go longer than I expect. But yeah, we do want to preview the Tennessee Smokies. But honestly, at the same time, we are preparing for the season that's happening now, right? So we'll be back to our regularly scheduled Tuesday morning releases. It'll be me with Brian Smith every other week, and then Greg Zumak hopping on the podcast every once a month or so, and then the rest of the episodes will be filled in by a various crew of guest hosts, right, between the broadcasters and folks like Brennan Miller and Tommy Birch and guys like that. So we will have a full season worth of Cubs minor league affiliates to talk about, worth of Cubs prospects. This is a prospect podcast. We'll talk about those guys over the course of the season. But like I said, let's dig in, because we did get a roster release from the Knoxville Smokies this morning, or this afternoon, I guess is when it was. We got a roster release. So all these other episodes where we've previewed the affiliates, we've been talking about like my projections for where a player may be and what we expect to see at each of the affiliates. Well, right now, because this is being recorded on Thursday, because opening day is today as you're recording, or as you're listening to this on Friday, we do get to see the actual roster. And so I will share this here. If you guys are watching on YouTube, you can see the roster from the Knoxville Smokies. If not, no big deal. It'll be like every other episode. We'll kind of refer to some of these players. I want to talk about some of these guys, right? So we do have a roster release based on their roster that they released in the graphic. There were 26 names. Also in the write-up on the Knoxville Smokies website, we did see an additional player in Ed Howard. We'll get to that. So I think 27 names. This is not really the roster that we were expecting to see necessarily from the Knoxville Smokies, especially in the rotation. So we'll get into that to start off. We'll talk about the rotation, then we'll talk about the bullpen like we have been previously, and then we'll round that out with some infielders, outfielders, and catchers, and talk about those groups individually. So let's get right into this. The pitching staff is interesting. I'd say that really the strongest part of this roster is probably the bullpen at the top end is nice. There's some catchers that we love to watch. The infielders have a pretty decent group, but really coming into the season before this roster was released, we expected Knoxville at Double-A level to have the strongest rotation by a long shot in all the organization. We thought that was going to be the organization that we would tune into on a nightly basis in order to watch the starting pitcher work. And there's still a couple of really strong pitchers, but it's not exactly the group that we had expected, right? So there are a few names. There are, I guess, three names that we thought might have a chance to start off this year in Double-A. Those were, I guess, four names, really, if you think about it. There were Arian Rodriguez, Jaxon Wiggins, Drew Gray, and Nick Dean. All four of those guys had a chance to start off the year in Knoxville, kind of bouncing between Knoxville and South Bend on where we projected each of those guys. But none of those four guys are found on this roster in the initial release for opening night for Double-A Knoxville. So that's really interesting. That kind of shifts my focus, at least on a nightly basis, to focusing on South Bend and their rotation. But there are two guys that I think are worth calling out here. And they're the top two guys on this graphic. That is Sam Armstrong and Will Sanders. Both those guys will be appointment television when they take the mound once a week for the Knoxville Smokies. Sam Armstrong, I'll start off with him. He is kind of my breakout pick this year. I think that he had a really strong year in 2024, but there were, as I mentioned throughout the offseason, there were a lot of different things about Sam Armstrong's performance in 2024 that resembled Brandon Birdsell's performance in 2023. And so if you're following that trend, then Sam Armstrong is going to be lined up to be the Cubs minor league pitcher of the year in 2025, right? Just like Brandon Birdsell was last year. Now, I don't think that those should be our expectations of Sam Armstrong going into the season, but the fact that he is going to be atop the rotation, throwing, I don't know things will be lined up, but in terms of guys that are most ready for the AAA level and to compete well at the AAA level, Sam Armstrong might be that guy that's I think most prepared. I think that he is most prepared to have a strong start to his season in Double-A Knoxville, and so I think that him getting the ball every sixth day, typically in the Double-A level, we'll see guys going once a week between that Tuesday to Sunday setup for a series. We'll see that guys going once a week, and so AAA is when they go to the once every 5 days, like the major league level. So Sam Armstrong is probably my guy to watch, not only in Knoxville but on the mound. One of my guys to watch throughout the entire system, along with some of those other guys in Erian Rodriguez and Jackson Wiggins. I think Sam Armstrong is definitely up there. The other guy that is slated for the rotation in Double-A Knoxville is Will Sanders. And so Will Sanders he caught my eye last year, right? We talked about Will Sanders in comparison to Jackson Wiggins a lot. How Will Sanders just seems to be a little bit more polished version with not quite as electric of stuff as what we see from Jackson Wiggins on a nightly basis. But Will Sanders has good stuff. We saw him perform in the spring breakout game and do really well. And we know that he's an absolute character out there, right? Between the interview that he did on Marquee during that spring breakout performance, what we heard from Brendan King, the South Bend Cubs broadcaster, when he was on the show earlier this month, last month. Obviously, Will Sanders is a guy that we will really root hard for throughout the season, and I'm really excited to see what things look like from Will Sanders in terms of a consistency standpoint, right? I think it's going to be really, really key for him, not only to improve upon his stuff just a tick, right? I don't think the stuff needs to get outrageously better. I think between the fastball, maybe adding a tick or two of velocity, or the slider to be have a little bit more break. I think what we're going to look for as far as consistency goes from Will Sanders probably looks more at what he's doing in terms of command and control, and really command more than anything. I want him working on the edges of the zone rather than missing in the heart of the zone a little bit more, or missing outside by quite a bit. So Will Sanders is another. I think those two guys, Sam Armstrong and Will Sanders, are the guys to watch in this rotation, because the rest of the rotation is going to be pretty much filled with guys that are more organizational guys, right? Guys that we've seen in the organization for quite some time. I When I'm looking at this list of opening day assignments for the Knoxville Smokies, I'm looking at Tyler Santana. We have Chris Kachmar. Both of those guys are guys that have bounced back and forth between the rotation and the bullpen during their time in the Cubs organization. Both guys are in their upper 20s at this point. They're no longer like your traditional prospects in the fact that they're younger 20s or mid 20s. These are guys that have made it up to Double-A now, but they are in their upper 20s in terms of age. So those are two guys that I'm watching for to kind of fill out the rotation. But that's only four names, guys. That's only four starting pitchers that I see at first glance. The other names, we've seen Nick Hull be a starting pitcher in years past, but I really think that conversion over to the bullpen happened this year for him. Grant Kipp is another guy we saw in the rotation quite a bit. I kind of expected a transition into the bullpen for Grant Kipp this year, but he may get that fifth starter spot in Knoxville. And then there's some other guys, some minor league Rule 5 draft picks that the Cubs acquired this past season. That's Will Jensen from the Giants, and then that's also Robert Kwiatkowski. Excuse me on the pronunciation there, Robert. But those are both guys that ended up converting into the bullpen last year with their respective teams, and so maybe both those guys are someone we see working out of the rotation a little bit more. I know that Kwiatkowski was a guy that was called out specifically by this front office as someone that's impressed them in spring training, and he's the guy. Robert Kwiatkowski is the guy with the knuckleball. He's a knuckleballer. Now, when I say that he's a knuckleballer, he is not throwing 90% knuckleballs with a fastball ripped in there every once in a while. He uses that as a part of his arsenal, not the feature of his arsenal, which I think is kind of interesting. I don't know. There's not a whole lot of guys that throw the knuckleball in general out in baseball now, but for a guy to not necessarily feature the knuckleball, but still throw it is like a really, I don't know. That's an interesting concept to me. So we may see him or Will Jensen, both minor league Rule 5 picks, moved to the rotation. And maybe that was part of the plan, right? And I know that the Cubs were more active in terms of pitching in the minor league phase of the Rule 5 draft this December. And maybe that was the intention, was they knew all along that they would send Jaxon, Wiggins, and Drew Gray and Arian Rodriguez and Nick Dean back down to South Bend. And because of that, they needed to fill some innings in Knoxville to start off, especially to start off this year. So I think all four of those guys that aren't here that I mentioned before, we will see up in Knoxville soon, right? I think that they just need to get a handful of starts, maybe not even that many, in South Bend before they get the bump up. And as we can see here, there's not a whole lot of uh, uh, top prospects filling that rotation that you would feel like, oh man, we really gotta kick this guy to the bullpen, and that's unfortunate. So I think that once those guys are ready to be promoted up to Knoxville, they will, and it'll be good to go. So those are the names I'm kind of looking for in the rotation. I'll transition here to the bullpen, and I want to go back to Nick Hull, what I mentioned before. I think that he has been over this offseason a name that I have really kept an eye on, and obviously not pitching over the offseason, but a guy that I've kept an eye on leading into this 2025 season as a bullpen guy that could take off. And so the fact that he's been assigned to Knoxville, to the upper levels of the minors to start off this 2025 campaign, I really hope that he is a guy that's used as a reliever. That's a 1 inning, 2 inning reliever out of the bullpen in Knoxville, and not a guy that's used as a rotation piece or even a swing piece. So early on in the season, we see a lot of piggyback type starts, even at this level in Double-A. We see some piggyback outings. I really hope that Nick Hull is not used in that capacity in Knoxville. I really hope that instead of being a piggyback guy, instead of being a guy that goes 4 innings, 3 innings, something like that, I want to see Nick Hull as a true reliever. And I think that if he is used in that way, we could see him up pretty quickly up to AAA Iowa, and then kind of all hands are on deck in terms of making the major league bullpen work. And so Nick Hull is my name to watch here in this Knoxville bullpen. And part of the reason is because we kind of I expected Nick Hull to be there. If we're looking at the best reliever on this roster, the best reliever on this roster right now is Frankie Scalzo Jr. We saw him start off the year last year in Knoxville, and we talked about Frankie up at the AAA preview as well for Iowa. But Frankie Scalzo Jr. is way too good to be in Knoxville. He started off last year there, and during his time in Double-A, did not give up a single run in any of his outings. And so he had a 0 ERA for the first couple months, first half of the year last year in Double-A. He got called up to AAA Iowa. He struggled a little bit during his time there, but he's too good to be in Double-A Knoxville, is Frankie Scalzo Jr. So really the reason why he's there, the reason why he's at this level, is because of the extreme depth the Cubs have in the bullpen up there at the AAA level. And we talked about that a little bit, Brian and I did, to start off, or not, I guess mid off season is when Brian and I talked about it, where it's like guys like Riley Miller and Frankie Scalzo, or not Riley Miller, Riley Martin, sorry. A guy like Riley Martin and Frankie Scalzo are younger guys that we might see drop down to the Knoxville level. We saw Riley Martin stay up in Iowa. Frankie Scalzo is the one that's kind of the odd man out as far as depth. And the reason why Frankie is that guy is because there's guys that have logged major league innings in the Iowa bullpen right now, the Phil Bickfords and the Trevor Richards and guys like that you're not going to send those guys down to Double-A, right? Because they have major league innings under their belt, versus Frankie Scalzo Jr. does not. So as soon as some of that depth goes away in Iowa, and that's going to look like a guy like Phil Bickford or Trevor Richards or something like that opting out of his contract when May 1st rolls around. A lot of times May 1st is when major league vets that are on minor league deals receive opt-outs to pursue other paths in terms of where they end up in their careers. So May 1st is when I've got my eyes on Frankie Scalzo Jr. getting bumped back up to AAA Iowa, where he belongs. So other notable bullpen guys here. Zach Leigh is a guy that we've been waiting to break out for the past few years. A good ride on his fastball, good slider. He incorporated a curveball a whole lot more last year in 2024. And so Zach Leigh, also a guy that's getting quite a bit older for a traditional prospect. He's in his upper 20s as well. But I think that the back end of that bullpen in Knoxville, between Frankie Scalzo Jr. acting as the closer, Zach Leigh and Nick Hull as the kind of setup man, that's a really good back end of the bullpen for the Knoxville Smokies this year. And so being able to lean on those guys is going to be impressive. Mitchell Tyranski is another guy. I think we might have talked about Mitchell Tyranski on the South Bend preview, but I know we also talked about him because I think that I don't know that I picked him in my fantasy team, my Cubs minor league fantasy team, but I know I talked about him there because I think I ended up taking JP Wheat instead of Mitchell Tyranski as my last pick of that draft. But Tyranski was really impressive last year between the lower levels of the minors, and so he's a guy that was signed as a minor league free agent last year, and I think that he's really impressive in addition to these other guys. So there's some other names worth mentioning that we've seen in this organization for quite some time. Kane Eckert has been around for a long time. We've seen a lot of action from Kane Eckert in Major League Spring Training games, both of the past 2 seasons. So he'll be in the Knoxville bullpen, as will Brad Depperman, who was a draft pick by the Cubs, ended up being a starting pitcher, ended up hanging around for a while. And I think that he ended up retiring from baseball, but ended up coming back last year in 2024. I might have my timelines wrong on that, but he came back. He was back in the organization last year, throwing in South Bend out of the bullpen. And so we'll see him now out of the bullpen in Double-A Knoxville. So I think those are pretty much the names that I wanted to mention here. That's pretty. I guess one more bullpen name that is worth mentioning because of his crazy story to get to this point. That's Ben Leeper. Ben Leeper will be in the bullpen in Double-A Knoxville. He's coming off of 3 Tommy John surgeries, which I knew this off the top of my head at one point. I don't now, but he'd be one of, I think, like 2 other guys that have come back from 3 Tommy John surgeries to end up pitching professionally. One was Jason Isringhausen, and I think Johnny Venters might have been the other guy. Obviously, Isringhausen, we remember him towards the end of the end of his career with the Cardinals, and Johnny Venters, I pictured Venters with the Atlanta Braves. But crazy company for Ben Leeper to be in, to return and have the both the mental and physical strength to come back from a 3rd Tommy John surgery. And so in terms of him getting back to throwing 98, or him just shutting down opposing lineups as a 9th inning, as a closer, as something like that, isn't what we should expect from Ben Leeper. But just the fact that he got back to this point is honestly, it's pretty incredible. So like I said, that bullpen is full of fun nuggets and fun performers out there in that bullpen in Knoxville. So that's kind of, while I'm not tuning in necessarily, like the way I consume Cubs minor league baseball is not to see how good the bullpen is in at different levels. I'm not tuning in specifically for a bullpen. This Knoxville bullpen is one that I may stick around for. I may watch a Will Sanders outing and then stick around to watch the end of the game to see guys like Ben Leeper or Frankie Scalzo or Zach Leigh go out there and get after it towards the back end of these games for Double-A Knoxville. So that does it for the pitching staff. I look like I'm doing pretty good as far as timing goes. Hopefully you're not sick of my voice 18 minutes into this episode, but yeah, like we're about halfway through. We still got to cover the infielders, outfielders, and catchers in this group. And so let's go ahead and transition into, let's talk infielders first. I think it's, well, actually, before we get into the infielders specifically, it's kind of an interesting group where let's say there's only 4 infielders on this graphic. There's 5 infielders that we know are going to be assigned to Knoxville. Only 4 outfielders. So there's not a whole lot of bench help for this team. I know that the AAA level can hold, the Double-A level, I believe, can hold up to 28 guys on their roster, and this will have 27 guys. And so just not a whole lot of help. I had Rafael Morel also slated, projected to be in Double-A Knoxville, and he was not announced as a part of this roster. And so not a whole lot of depth. There's going to be a lot of at bats to go around for all of these infielders and outfielders. That's for sure. So let's go into the infielders first. Hayden McGeary is the guy that he is likely going to man first base on a daily basis. He'll be over there at first base and logging a lot of innings over there. He might get spelled every once in a while by Felix Stevens getting some run over at first base, or BJ Murray getting some run at first base, or one of the 3 catchers on the roster. But Hayden McGeary is looking for a big bounce back year. Obviously, coming off of 2023, where he was terrific, looking like the next Matt Mervis, looking like what we saw from Johnny Long last year, like just really, really impressive season from Hayden McGeary in 2023, followed up by 2024, where just about everything that could go wrong went wrong for Hayden McGeary. It was a really rough season back at Double-A Knoxville. So he's back there now for this will be the 3rd year that he's spent at Double-A Knoxville will Hayden McGeary. Looking for a big bounce back from him, especially given the fact that he's going to be given as many at bats and as many chances as he will this year at the Double-A level. I mentioned BJ Murray Jr. is another guy that can play some first base, but really I can kind of see him just like Hayden McGeary. I think that BJ Murray logs a lot of innings at third base if the Cubs are still wanting to go that route of developing him as a third baseman. He also is back at Double-A and will spend his third season at Double-A Knoxville as well. BJ Murray is coming off another, like Hayden McGeary, a really rough season in 2024, following a season in 2023 where he was terrific. And so BJ Murray, it's all about tapping into that power a little bit more consistently. It is more than just relying on his ability to draw a lot of walks, where we even saw that number come down a little bit for BJ Murray last year, where like his big thing with BJ Murray was the fact to work good at bats and draw lots of walks. And if he can't really put the fear of the long ball in the pitcher's mind, then they're going to pitch him in the zone a little bit more, and those walks will come down. So I'm curious to see how he looks in terms of the power output to begin the 2025 campaign in Knoxville. The two middle infielders that can also, I think Hayden Cantrelle is the guy that's probably going to be manning shortstop, while Pedro Ramirez mans second base. Both those guys can play elsewhere, right? Hayden Cantrelle can play second, can play third, can play a little bit of outfield if you want him to. Pedro Ramirez, we've seen at second, we've seen him at third. I don't know that we've seen him much at shortstop during his time in the full season affiliates, but we saw him at shortstop as a complex league player, and we also saw him in the outfield as a complex league player a little bit more as well. But at this point, I view Pedro Ramirez as mostly just a second baseman, and I think Pedro is the guy that is the best hitting prospect of this roster, right? Pedro Ramirez is that guy. I have him ranked in the teens somewhere, right? Somewhere between 14 and 19 or so is where I have Pedro Ramirez. And so kind of like BJ Murray to a certain degree, we need to see more power from Pedro Ramirez. Much different players in terms of the way that they play the game. Pedro Ramirez is much higher contact rates, maybe not contact quality, but much higher contact rates for Pedro. I want to see his improved defense at second base a little bit more. Want to continue to see him steal some bases once he gets on base. And so just kind of putting everything together and showing a little bit more pop at the plate is what's going to be really important for Pedro Ramirez. I think this is a really big year for Pedro, right? Between getting up to the upper levels of the minors in Knoxville and really showing that he can put everything together. I think that this is a big year for him to either be a guy that by the end of the year is a top 10 prospect in this organization, or by the end of the year is a guy that's dropped way down like the 40s range in terms of the prospect rankings. This is going to be a big year for I don't think that Pedro ends the year in the teens as far as where he ranks among the prospects in the system. I think that he ends the year either as a top 10 guy or as a guy down near 40 because of how big of a season and showing that a guy with his stature and a guy that hits in the way that he does can hack it up at the upper levels of the minors. This is a big year, big promotion up to this level. That'll be worth keeping an eye on. Hayden Cantrelle is that other guy that I mentioned here. Hayden Cantrelle was really good last year between Knoxville and then even when he got promoted up to Iowa during his time there at AAA. He is really a guy that can play all over the diamond. I like his approach to the plate. He doesn't bring a whole lot of pop to the game, but like he plays a lot like Pedro Ramirez. Both these guys are very similar in the way they play the game. And so Hayden Cantrelle was a minor league Rule 5 pick a couple of years ago. And so less prospect pedigree from Hayden Cantrelle than Pedro Ramirez, but very similar players in a lot of different ways. All right, let's go. Actually, one more infielder that is not listed on this graphic on your screen if you're watching on YouTube, but like I said, was announced on the Knoxville Smokies website and the press release there that Ed Howard will be in the Knoxville roster entering the 2025 campaign. Now, I don't know why he was not included on this graphic. I don't know what the deal was. Maybe it was just an oversight. Maybe he will start the year on the dev list, which that's a very real possibility that it starts on the development list, which is really like a guy has to spend a week on the development list before he can get activated. But I think that the Cubs would want the Cubs/Smokies would like to see him on the roster, not on the dev list, especially given the lack of depth in this infield. Having only 4 guys listed, having Ed Howard will be and having Ed Howard where he can play shortstop and can play second base, because right now like Pedro Ramirez is kind of your backup shortstop, and I don't I don't know that I like Pedro. Like, I don't like that as shortstop depth defensively. So Ed Howard is going to be a guy that's going to play some second, going to play some short. We might see him at some third base as well this season. Um, Obviously, not the prospect that we had hoped in terms of that real high pedigree when he was drafted, but there's still a lot of elements that he brings to the table that the Cubs seem to really like having Ed Howard in this organization. Heard nothing but good things about Ed Howard from the moment he was drafted until right now, right? I think that coaches seem to love him, whether it's managers or position coaches. The front office seems to love him. His teammates seem to love him. And so having Ed Howard in this organization is a positive, even if fans don't view it as a successful career based on where he was drafted in that first round pick. So really excited to see Ed Howard make his way out of South Bend, which he deserves, man. Holy cow. He's been in South Bend a while. I think that it's going to be important to see Ed Howard at a different level, just getting a little bit of a different taste of a different environment in Knoxville. This will be a different environment for everybody playing in Knoxville compared to Kodak from last year, but that's going to be really important for Ed Howard this year, I think. All right. So let's go ahead and go to the outfield here. The first name that I want to mention here is Felix Stevens. We've talked about him a little bit over the offseason. Felix Stevens, I think the Cubs now at this point view him as a right fielder. He played a lot of first base coming up the first few years of his career in the organization, but now he seems to be listed as outfield everywhere. He played a lot of innings last year in right field. I think that he's an outfielder, and I think that the athleticism is pretty damn good for a big guy like Felix Stevens. We know the raw power is probably the best in the entire system, in a system that includes Owen Casey. I think that Felix Stevens has the best raw power in the organization. Obviously, he strikes out at a really, really high clip, 35% clip or so last year. So seeing him in Double-A Knoxville is going to be fun. It's going to be fun seeing him log, again, 500 at bats and see how many homers he can rack up. So really like Felix Stevens. I don't know that I consider him a top 30 or 40 prospect in this organization, but he's definitely a fun guy. And another guy that's really, really impressive in terms of his makeup off the field. So Jaylen Palmer is the other guy I want to mention here. Jaylen Palmer will likely open the season as the starting center fielder in Knoxville, and I think he's an interesting kind of guy to watch. Right, he was signed as a minor league free agent a few weeks ago. It was like halfway through spring training he signed. He was previously with the Mets, I believe. And the way I view Jaylen Palmer is he spent last year in Double-A. I think that he's probably pretty close to being ready for Triple-A, and he's not your prototypical prospect. I think this roster, we'll get to this at the end, but not really littered with top prospects. But Jaylen Palmer, I view as a guy that's going to start off the year manning center field every single day for the Knoxville Smokies until Brett Bateman is healthy, because Brett Bateman will be the starting center fielder in Knoxville once he returns from his, I believe it was a hamate injury for Brett Bateman. And so there were some rumblings that Bateman is getting more and more ready to be assigned to an affiliate. Maybe we'll see him in a few weeks. Whenever that may be, I think that could time out really, really well, where Brett Bateman becomes ready for Double-A Knoxville. And at the same time, up at the Triple-A level, we see a guy like Greg Allen, who utilizes one of his opt-outs on May 1st or so to go become a free agent. And so that times out well, where Jaylen Palmer can go from being the starting center fielder in Knoxville to being a guy that's coming off the bench in the outfield in Iowa and gets that promotion up to Triple-A. And so that all times out really well. That's kind of my expectation for Jaylen Palmer moving forward this season. The other two guys are really just org guys at this point. Jordan Nwogu, which we've heard a lot about over the past few years. He was a COVID 2020 draft pick. And then Parker Chavers, who was a guy that I just love to watch hit. The way that he hits is really, really fun. Both guys are getting up there in age in terms of traditional prospects, and a breakout would be fairly surprising, but super, super fun. I think that if I'm picking between Jordan Nwogu and Parker Chavers in terms of a breakout for this year, I'd probably go with Jordan Nwogu. I think my hope is that he kind of puts it all together. We know that he can play some decent defense out in the outfield, can man center field a little bit if he needs to. He's got speed on the bases. Same goes for Parker Chavers. Can play some center field, can play some good outfield defense, has some speed on the bases. I think that Jordan Nwogu's power potential is better than Parker Chavers, although I really like the way, like I said, Parker Chavers swings the bat. So both those guys will be getting pretty consistent at bats. Maybe we see a platoon with Jordan Nwogu and Parker Chavers in the outfield playing left field this year. Parker Chavers obviously hitting against righties, Jordan Nwogu hitting against lefties with some tweaking here and there. So I wouldn't be surprised if all of these guys get a lot of at bats in the outfield in Knoxville this year. All right, guys. The final position group that I want to talk about before kind of looking at the roster as a whole here in Knoxville are these catchers, and the catching group from a vibe standpoint, from an aura standpoint, is through the roof. So we talked about Pablo Aliendo in our Iowa preview because we thought that he'd be assigned there. Obviously, the Iowa Cubs have plenty of catching depth there. Between having Reese McGuire stay in the organization, they have Carlos Perez, who is staying in the organization, in addition to Moises Ballesteros. So they already had 3 catchers in Iowa. Really no room for Pablo Aliendo to be there. Very similar situation for Pablo as we see with Frankie Scalzo Jr., which is the major league, the major / minor league depth at the AAA level. Just kind of forced Pablo Aliendo down. I think he's ready for the AAA level, but we'll get to see his big power in action back in Knoxville. I know the fans in Knoxville, in Tennessee and Kodak last year, but the fans down there in Tennessee absolutely love Pablo Aliendo. He's a fan favorite everywhere he goes. He was a fan favorite in South Bend. People love Pablo Aliendo because of the vibes that he brings to the ballpark every single day. So excited to see Pablo Aliendo. We got 2 other catchers, Casey Opitz and Ethan Hearn, who have spent a lot of time together over the past couple of years, and they kind of feed off each other's energy. All 3 of these guys seem to be great in the dugout. They seem to be great working with pitching staffs, and obviously the Cubs value in a huge way a catcher that works well with the pitching staff. And I think that Sam Armstrong, Will Sanders, Nick Hull, Frankie Scalzo, Ben Leeper, all these guys will benefit off having these 3 catchers as their catchers on a daily basis, whether it's Pablo Aliendo starting, or Ethan Hearn coming in and giving him a break, or any of these guys working down in the bullpen at any point, whether it's an off day or during the game as they warm up. All 3 of these guys will be really important. Ethan Hearn is kind of a potential breakout candidate. I know that Alex Cohen, broadcaster for Marquee Sports Network, is really high on Ethan Hearn and the breakout that we might see from Ethan Hearn this year. He put together a pretty impressive second half of the season last year in South Bend. He was a high school catching draft pick, which those guys take a little bit longer to develop. I'm not saying that Ethan Hearn is going to end up developing into a top 10 prospect in this organization or even a top 20 prospect in this organization, but I will say that Ethan Hearn is on my top 10 short list of potential breakout candidates here in this organization. So Ethan Hearn is a guy to watch. We know Casey Opitz defensively is probably the best defensive catcher in this organization. I think that Ariel Armis probably is going to give him a little bit of a run for that award, but defensively, Casey Opitz is terrific, and I've said it since the day he was drafted that if he can hit just not awful at any level, like he doesn't have to be a good or even average hitter, but if he can be just a not awful hitter, then there's some real value with Casey Opitz as he kind of climbs the ladder up to AAA. So I think that all of these guys we could see in AAA at some point this year for the Cubs. I think Pablo Aliendo was probably the first guy up as soon as Carlos Perez or Reese McGuire opts out of his contract. And then I think that Casey Opitz is a guy that's going to be up and down throughout the organization. We may see him back and forth between Knoxville and Iowa throughout the year. We may even see him fill in at South Bend if they need him to fill in at South Bend. And then Ethan Hearn, probably end of the year this year, is a guy that we might see in Iowa. But I think that he'll have to produce in order to get up to Iowa for sure. All right, guys, that's everybody. I think I mentioned almost everybody on this list that is on the opening night roster for the Knoxville Smokies. I guess overall, when looking at this roster, like this is not a championship winning roster like we've seen in the past few years, right? Last year we started off the year with an absolutely stacked roster for Knoxville. That was when James Triantos was there, and Matt Shaw and Owen Casey and Kevin Alcantara, like all those guys that are now in AAA. Obviously started last year at the Double-A level in Knoxville. And so when you look at this roster, it's not exactly the stacked roster that we saw last year, or even the same roster that we saw towards the end of the year last year when Matt Shaw and James Triantos and all those guys ended up being called up to the AAA level. There's not a whole lot of top prospects here. Like I said, Pedro Ramirez is probably one of the top guys. I'd say that if you're going to the ballpark to Knoxville to watch these Smokies play, hitting wise, you're looking at Pedro Ramirez being kind of the top prospect there. And then Pablo Aliendo is probably the second highest ranked prospect in his organization. Those are both, like I said, I think Pedro Ramirez is in the teens. I think Pablo Aliendo is probably between 30 and 40 or so in this organization. And then on the arm side, I know relievers are weird and different, but in terms of where they get ranked. But same Armstrong, probably in the 20 range, like 20 to 30 range where he's ranked. Will Sanders probably not far ahead of him. I'd say Will Sanders maybe 10 between 15 and 20. Same Armstrong between 20 and 30. But those are kind of the names to watch this year in terms of the top prospects on this roster in Double-A Knoxville. It'll be fun to watch on specific nights. It'll be fun to pay attention to what these individual guys are doing and see who ends up breaking out, if guys break out. And then, like I said, the Smokies roster will get even better as the season wears on, adding in guys like Jaxon Wiggins and Drew Gray and Erian Rodriguez to this rotation that is already has the two top dogs up there. Once you add those guys into the mix, it'll get super fun. Then you throw in the potential to see Jefferson Rojas later this year, who we didn't really get the chance to talk about a whole lot during these previews. But I think that we expect to see Jefferson Rojas in High A South Bend once he gets back from injury. And then towards the end of the season or midseason, towards the end of the season, we could see Jefferson Rojas manning shortstop on a daily basis for these Knoxville Smokies. And so there are guys on the way to help out the Smokies roster. And I think that for right now, we enjoy who's currently there and take that in as it comes. So, all right, guys, I've talked for 36 minutes straight, just me, about this Knoxville Smokies roster. Like I said, that puts a bow on this season preview season over here at the Cubs on Deck podcast. Like I said, I apologize for the weird schedule releases of all these previews and the weird schedule over the past few weeks or so over the course of the month of March and into April. But as long as you bared with me there, you should be back to some normal, regularly scheduled programming moving forward. So we'll be dropping episodes starting this upcoming Tuesday. Brian and I will be on the show, and we'll just be like we do every single year. We'll be rapping and talking about a little bit about rapping, WRAPPING, not RAP. We will not be rapping on the show, but we'll be wrapping up what we see each week in the Cubs farm system. We'll be talking about the prospects. This is your prospect podcast, right? This is the show where we get to talk and nerd out about the prospects throughout the system. As the season wears on too, we get to transition from talking in the offseason. We talk a lot about top prospect rankings, and we talk about the top guys in this organization. And for this case, it's guys that are in the highest levels of the minors in AAA. So as the season wears on, as we see graduations from Kevin Alcantara, as we see graduations from Cade Horton, and potentially some other guys, Owen Casey maybe, as we see those graduations happen and the debuts happen up in Chicago, then we'll be forced to talk about other players in the organization. And really during the season, we can talk about these guys that are a little bit deeper down, some more nerdy type picks in terms of who we're talking about. So if you guys are into that, we will be talking about some deeper cut names throughout this season. But we're just really, really super excited to talk about Cubs prospects for another full season. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. Thank you guys so much for supporting this show. And we'll be back in your ears in just a few short days. Take care, guys.
Yeah.